Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. Hello. It is nice to see you all. Happy Thursday. I'm Rachel Scheinerman, the editor of My Jewish Learning, and you have stumbled into, or perhaps intentionally come, to Daf Yomi Week in Review. This week, we are joined by Dr. Sarah Ronis, who will spend the next 30 minutes zooming us through some highlights of what we learned in Daf Yomi this week.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Good evening. I see some folks already starting to introduce themselves in the chat. I am joining you today from San Antonio, Texas, where the high today is supposed to be 85. So wishing you all a warm and sunny day. So this has been a week where actually we had a fairly consistent set of conversations. There were very few topics, and we really focused in on a couple major issues. The first was the discussion of Yeush, despair, an extended discussion of what leads someone to despair of getting a lost object back. What happens if despair can happen if something is taken without the owner's knowledge or consent. Then we shifted to talking about what makes a distinguishing mark, whether distinguishing marks even matter when things are lost in a really public space, whether the location matters when something is lost at all. From there, we did jump into a couple of more specific, shorter topics. The questions of despair and the distinguishing mark took up most of this week's discussion, but there were some other discussions. One was this fascinating discussion about what makes a Torah scholar trustworthy to say, yes, that's my object, and have us believe them. That gets into this extended discussion of the dynamics between teachers and students. We found a series of cases where someone finds meat on the ground and a discussion of whether or not it's considered kosher. My strong medical opinion, based on not having any medical training at all, is if you find meat on the ground, don't eat it. But apparently things were different back then. We discussed what happens if you find something in the garbage. And that made me think of sort of the modern phenomena of dumpster diving. What if you find something in the wall, in a store? Rob just wrote in the chat that gives a whole new meaning to grounded beef or ground beef. And I think that is both a delightful pun and also horrifying. What happens if you find something in a wall or a store or on a money changer's table, places where maybe money is expected to be, or maybe you would never expect to see money? And from there, we shifted a little bit to why the Torah specifies that you have to return a donkey, a sheep, an ox, or a garment, right? Why these four things the Torah lists and not other things? And then finally, because you can never get enough discussion of distinguishing marks, we ended with this discussion about whether the obligation to announce and put up flyers if you find something with the distinguishing mark, whether that obligation is a biblical obligation or a rabbinic obligation. So in some ways, actually a much more consistent set of discussions this week than we've had in the past. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite everyone to please tell us what was the most interesting thing you read about in this week's Daf in the chat. And while you do that, I'm going to share a link to one of the things I thought was the most interesting in the Daf, and that's what we'll spend most of our time discussing. But my hope is we'll have some time to also talk about the things that you found particularly interesting. Dr. Scheinerman, I'm going to share my screen, which means I won't be able to see the chat. So if other folks are joining in and you want to reshare that link, please go ahead. And if anybody asks a question that you really want to us to stop and talk about in the interim, just unmute and let me know. How do I share? Okay, here we go. Amazing. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Didn't want to share the whole screen. Now you're seeing my notes. I know, who would have thought I taught off of notes? Everyone with that. Okay, all right. So what I was particularly interested in was this discussion, which in order to understand the discussion, right, the basic conversation we're having throughout is this conversation about when you're obligated to return something to somebody who lost it, right? When are you obligated to, if you find something, return it? And there are three biblical verses which the rabbis use to argue for that obligation. And you all can see my screen now? And it's just the handout? Okay, great. The first biblical verse comes from Leviticus. You shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. And here, what I want to note is that middle section, you shall not commit robbery. That is a negative commandment, right? Here's a thing God says, don't do. Then we have two verses in Deuteronomy. And just so everybody notes, there is a Deuteronomy 22, verse 2, which I did not include. So if you're like, hey, there seems to be a jump, correct. The Talmud doesn't seem to think verse 2 is relevant to this particular discussion. So I was trying to keep us focused. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 1 and 3 say, if you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your peer. You shall do the same with their donkey. You shall do the same with their garment, with their anything they lose and you find. You must not remain indifferent. So, if we read these verses, the rabbis say here are some other specific commandments. One commandment is a positive commandment. You have to take it back, right? It's not just you can't commit robbery, you actually or fraud. You actually have to return the thing that you found. And then the last piece that the rabbis are going to pick up is at the end of verse 3, where it says you must not remain indifferent. Again, a negative commandment. You can't just be like, I didn't see anything, right? Even if you're really busy. So these are the three biblical verses that the rabbis are going to look at as the source for the discussion about the obligation to pick up lost things and return them. And that gets us to a really fascinating set of theoretical cases that are laid out in Baba Metzia 26b. And that's what I'd like to spend the bulk of our time with today. So before I do that, are there any questions about the biblical pieces?
We have quite a lot of questions coming in, but it might make sense to hold some of these until the end because they're not specifically on biblical.
Okay, fantastic. So let's shift to the Talmud, and then we can talk about all of the questions on the Talmud, which is, I'm guessing, where the questions are. So I guess just in the interest of time, I'll read for a bit, and then maybe I'll pass it off to someone else. So Rava said, if one saw a Sela coin that fell from another, okay, so somebody has a coin that falls out of their pocket and you see it. If he took it to steal it before the despair of the owner, right? The owner might not even know it's fallen out of his pocket. He violates all of the three mitzvot that the rabbis see as the root of returning an object. He is liable due to the prohibition, right? The negative commandment, do not rob, and the positive commandment, you shall return them, and the negative commandment, you can't ignore it. All right. So if you see somebody have something fall out of their pocket and you immediately run up behind them and steal it before they even know it was lost, you are liable for violating three commandments. Okay. What happens if he feels bad about that afterwards? If he returned it after the despair. So now in theory, it's his because the guy's given up the original owner has despaired of ever returning it. Can he undo his theft just by giving it back? No. It is merely a gift that he gave him, and the transgression that he performed. He can give it back, and that's great, but he's still liable for theft because he stole it before the owner gave up the ownership of the item or of the coin. Okay, so if you chase after somebody, watch as something falls out of their pocket, and then steal it, you are liable for transgressing three biblical commandments according to Rava. All right, can I get, maybe if somebody would volunteer, we could get a show of hands for somebody to read the next two sections, or the next paragraph.
Better if you raise a virtual hand, folks, because I can't see all of you on my screen at once.
As I always tell my students, not all at once, guys. It's overwhelming.
Well, we can also just, oh, here we go. It just takes a minute. All right, Pepita, you're the top of my list here.
Okay, where do I start?
If he took the coin.
If he took the coin in order to return it before the despair of the owner, and after the despair he intended to steal it, he violates, you shall return. If he waited until the owner despaired and then took it, he violates only, you may not disregard.
Excellent. So thank you so much, Pepita. So what we're saying here is, if he steals it, right, or if he takes it and he's like, oh, I think I'm going to return it, right? And then the owner despairs. And then after the despair, he's like, no, actually, I'm going to keep it. It's mine now, right? So he didn't start out intending to steal. He picked it up being like, oh, I'm going to follow that guy. And then he was like, but I'm tired, and that guy's going to give up. And, oh, he gave up, and now it's my coin. Then he is liable not for the theft necessarily, but for not returning the lost object when he should have. And then finally, in that last case, we see if he was like, I don't want to be liable for theft. I don't want to be liable for any of that. I'm just going to watch this coin I see it fall. I'm going to watch it come out of, I'm going to wait until the appropriate time where the owner will have despaired, and then I'm going to pick it up. He's still liable for do not disregard, right? And or you shall not ignore your fellow, right? You watched that coin and you were there in this moment where this guy gave up on ownership and you had the possibility or power to return it, and you didn't. So even if you think you're like, okay, but I'm not stealing, by the time I pick it up, I don't have to return it. That might be true, but it's also real shady, right? All right, I see a hand. Janine, do you have a question or a comment?
I have a question, and I feel like I've asked it before, but I'm asking it again. The bold versus the not bold in the
Yes. So because I adapted this translation from Sefaria's English translations of the Talmud, anything that's in bold is a direct translation from the Aramaic or the Hebrew, and anything that's in not bold is words that the editors have added for clarity. So the literal translation is or the word for word is bold, and then everything that they add, because it doesn't actually make sense in an English translation, if it's a word for translation, that they leave unbolded so that you know where they're adding. Great question. Great question. Robert?
Yeah, so I was wondering why in the second case, or the case we just read, first part, why it's not also you may not disregard. In other words, why only one and not another?
Yeah. So, that's a great question. And actually, medieval commentaries discuss whether they're saying, oh, it is that too, or not. So your question is a question that medieval commentaries and early modern commentaries continue to ask. I think the point that everybody agrees on is that he's not liable for robbing people, because he's never actually taking something, intending to keep it when the owner still thinks it's theirs. So great question, and I don't have an easy answer for you. Yeah, other questions or thoughts about this passage?
I've got a general question that's been asked in two different ways in the chat. So I think it might be, and it's much more general Talmudic question. I copied them over here. So I'm sorry. So Janine says, did the rabbis have a sense that their discussions would essentially become a course of law, a source of law? And then Brian Ratner, I'm sorry, I'm fumbling with asked a very similar question, which I've now lost. I am interested in how people generally would be aware of all these rules. How would I know what I should or should not be doing? So two very related questions, I think. One is, rabbis have it, right? This is not, we've moved sort of in this week, especially, I think this might be inspiring this question, from courtroom kind of things to private decisions that individuals are going to make, right? If you find an object, that's not going to be tried in court the way some of the other things we've looked at have been. So how do the rabbis know, how do the people know what the rabbis have ruled? And how do the rabbis know that the people are going to follow them? I think those are the two related questions.
Okay, fantastic questions. Thank you. And I think actually this section from Baba Metzia gives us a really wonderful sort of clue as to an answer. So one thing that I think is really important for us to know about the historical period in which the Talmud was developing is that actually the rabbis were not in charge of the Jewish community. We have lots of evidence that there were lots of different kinds of Jews in Babylonia, and some of them clearly saw the rabbis as powerful and authoritative and wanted to do what the rabbis said. And some of them seem to have, lots of people get up and tell me what I should be doing, and I ignore most of them because they're random people on the internet, right? So they were lots of people said, yep, that's one group, but that's not my group. Or perhaps even some people said they were wrong. And we know this from the Talmud itself because the rabbis talk about people who have other claims to authority that the rabbis think are wrong, or who don't listen to the rabbis because they think the rabbis are wrong, right? And again, the rabbis think those people are wrong. So I think one thing we have to understand is at this point, now later on, medieval history, we could talk about the ways that the Talmud becomes a normative, accepted more broadly Jewishly text. But at this period, the rabbis frame their discussion as talking to everyone most of the time, but it seems actually pretty clear that they're talking to a relatively self-selecting group. So they're talking to people who buy into the rabbinic project and rabbinic authority. And I think what we can see even in Rava's statement here is there's this assumption that that person may even know all of the Torah law about these things and how they apply. Now, is that likely for most people? Absolutely not, right? Especially given that lots of people might not have access to rabbinic teaching. Here, I'm thinking of lots of women. I'm thinking of children. I'm thinking of enslaved people who would have been Jews as well sometimes, right? So certainly we're not imagining a world where everyone, even everyone who was in a rabbinic household, would have had access to all of rabbinic law. But the rabbis are proposing a world, right? And again, I'm not saying it matches onto what was actually happening on the ground. The rabbis are proposing a world where everybody knows all of the details of rabbinic law, and that shapes their behavior from start to finish. That anytime you're walking in the marketplace and you see something fall, you immediately have to go through this intense set of calculations. And ultimately, what that would have done, if it worked in practice, is make the rabbinic way of life totalizing, right? So you're thinking about it from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, and maybe you're even dreaming about it. And kind of super publicly visible, because if you're moving through the market in a different way than everybody else, then everybody's going to be able to say, hey, this is a rabbinic Jew. So all of that is to say, how would this have been enforced? Likely in this period, it wouldn't have been. How would everybody have known all of these things? They wouldn't have. How would a select group of free rabbinic men who were adults have known these things through intense years of study and observing their teachers. But the rabbis are imagining or proposing a world where everybody is a rabbinic Jew. And that becomes really important when this text takes on greater prominence across the wider Jewish world once the Talmud is completed. So great questions, has a lot to do with history. And I want to just note, right, the rabbis are describing the world they want to see in the world they believe is the right world to see in the world. As we all know from anyone who's ever watched a political campaign, lots of people propose the world they want to see, which doesn't actually map onto the world that we live in all kinds of really important ways. Yeah, great questions. Yes.
Thank
Okay.
you. Maybe we should keep going to make sure we get through your material.
Fantastic. So, I read this piece in the Talmud, and this piece just has this sort of incredibly high degree of care that we're supposed to have about the objects of other people. And this real sense that doing that high degree of care, I'm going to scroll up for a minute for those of you who don't like watching it. Right, we get this real sense of here is how, right, based on the verses from Leviticus, that this is how you live in community, right? Do anything anything your fellow Israelite loses. You see your fellow Israelite. Don't defraud your fellow. The wages of a laborer, right? We get this real sense in the biblical verses that this is about how to live with each other in community, at least with your in-group in community. And thinking about that, thinking about this high degree of care that we're supposed to have, not just that we have to care and pay attention, but that we have to understand that what we're doing is because that is what, for the rabbis, God wants us to do and tells us to do in the Torah. Maybe think about this other piece in Baba Metzia 24 that we read this week. And this piece, I still don't know what to do with, so I'm going to be very frank with you. A silver goblet was stolen from the host of Mar Zutra Chasida. Right, so he's staying somewhere, and apparently other people are staying there, and the host has a silver goblet, and it goes missing. He saw a certain student. The word there in the Aramaic is someone in the household of the rabbi, who washed his hands and dried them on a different person's cloak. Right, he used the wrong. He did that thing that you do as a little kid when you're annoying your sibling, where he dries his hand on somebody else's dress, or maybe I'm the only one with sisters. He said, "This is one who does not care about the property of another." Okay, so let's stop there. So far, really normal story, right? We have a Mar Zutra Chasida. I'm imagining the mystery series, TV mystery series about Mar Zutra Chasida solving property crimes. And he is somewhere where a silver cup goes missing. He observes everyone else in the household, and he sees this one rabbinic student who, right, a student of the rabbi, who is not respectful of other people's personal property. And he says, oh, that guy, that behavior is what is, that tells me that this is the thief, right? Someone who isn't careful about other people's personal property is someone who steals. All right, now we get to the part where I was like, right? And here it is. He bound him and he confessed. So Mar Zutra Chasida does this thing with which, if you were watching a modern TV, crime solving scene, they cannot legally do. He, depending on how we understand the Aramaic, he ties the student up, or it's possible that he beats the student. The medieval commentators all think he is beating the student. They debate on how. And the student confessed. So Mar Zutra Chasida, to put this into modern terms, tortures a confession out of this student over a silver goblet. And when I read this, I thought to myself, I thought a number of things. First of all, today we have an extensive body of research that torture absolutely leads to confessions, but it doesn't necessarily lead to credible confessions, right? That people lie under torture. And the second thing that I thought about was, to my mind, on the one hand, yes, the crime is solved in theory. And on the other hand, what we're seeing is the absolute breakdown. I'm going to scroll back up. of the system laid out in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, right? Where we see everybody else as our fellow, right? Where we see everybody as our neighbor and our friend, and we are charged with behaving in ways of action, but also care towards them and their property. So I'm going to be honest with you. I don't actually know what to do with Mar Zutra Chassida's work. And maybe to go back to something I said to Rob, I'm in somewhat good company because the medieval commentators and the early modern commentators have a field day with this because it's really troubling. But I think what I would note and what I take from this is that a world where we don't respect other people's property, right? A world where we aren't having the care towards other people's possessions, even if we think we're doing it within the bounds of the law, right? The guy who sees it fall and waits until despair has happened to pick it up. Right, that world is a world that leads to social breakdown. That in a world where we just don't care enough about each other, and all of the things that make us us, including our stuff, that's a world where the fundamental social breakdown, right, the fundamental social bonds of behavior break down. And I think to some extent that's what the Torah is telling us in using the language of your neighbor or your fellow. And to some extent, that's how I can make sense of the story of Mar Zutra Chassida, though there are lots of other ways to make sense of it. But thinking about returning items to people as an ethic of care and as a way not just to return somebody's item, but to build the world or to maintain and build the world that we want to live in how we relate to each other. So that's what I had prepared for today, but we do have 3 minutes, and I saw a lot of things come into the chat. So I'd love to hear your thoughts either about that piece or about other pieces from this week that you'd like to talk about. Dr. Scheinman, what did you see in the chat?
Let me see. I think folks haven't had a chance to respond to Mar Zutra Chassida yet. Very, very interesting little tidbit. It is not uncommon for rabbinic stories to come in and totally upset all the halachic discussion that came above. My favorite example of this is the Choni story. Mm-hmm. Sarah knows I've loved that story since grad school. But, the whole story is about how you're supposed to, in the case of rain, call a communal fast. And then the Choni story is about the disaster that ensues when the community doesn't follow this procedure and tries to shortcut it with a magician, basically. All right. Yeah. So, okay. So with regard to Mar Zutra Chassida, Robert Starr says the Torah and the Talmud show both sides to stimulate thought. I kind of actually agree with him here. I don't know if you think so too. We could read this story, depending on who's reading this story, you could read it either way. You could read him as a hero or you could read him as a villain. And I think that I imagine it's quite intentional that they don't tell us how to read it.
Yeah. So, when I think about Robert, your question, I think about another Robert, actually. That's the legal theorist, Robert Cover, who wrote a really famous article in the 80s called Nomos and Narrative, which I just named in the chat. And in this piece, he argues that law and narrative work together to create a really a richer degree of complexity than either does alone in texts that include both law and story, right? So here I'm thinking about the Torah or the Talmud. And I think that part of what we are seeing, especially with this discussion, is the ways that the Talmud is dialogical, right? Meaning the Talmud is a dialogue. And I think what we're noticing is the Talmud's not just a dialogue between the rabbis of the page. The Talmud requires us, it demands us, right? The Talmud is hard, not because it's in Aramaic. We have wonderful translations now. The Talmud is hard because it actually demands us formulate our own responses, and it doesn't give us the answer. And so I think part of what you're noting is that this is the Talmud saying, you don't get the takeaway, you have to do the work, right? And that is And that is the challenge of it. There's a lot to talk about here. There absolutely is. But to some extent, to me, that's the feature of the Talmud, not a bug. Right? This is a text for grown-ups asking you to do grown-up thinking. And that's what's exciting about it, because we're adults on this room, and this isn't, Hebrew school. I love Hebrew school. Don't get me wrong. I used to teach Hebrew school. But Hebrew school is Judaism for children, and this is Judaism for adults.
Wow, I think we better let that one hang as the punctuation to class, because we are on the hour, even though we are getting requests in the chat to extend for 15 more minutes and so on and so forth, because people so appreciate what you do for us, Dr. Ronas. And of course, it is as rich as it is because of all of you and everything that you bring to the table. So I appreciate everybody on this call, and thank you. We cannot finish the discussions today, but we can come back next week and continue. And that is exactly what we'll do. So I hope everybody has a wonderful Thursday and an early Shabbat Shalom to everybody. And we'll see you in your inbox tomorrow morning and in this Zoom space in exactly a week's time. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.